Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind. Amp up your imagination and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. The Death of a Dentist by David McGee. Oakland, California is an industrial city bearing somewhat the same relationship to San Francisco that Brooklyn does to Manhattan. Visitors may wonder how she had acquired so sylvan a name. For today there is little about the town to suggest bosky glades or wooded vistas. But in 1880, when this story begins, Oakland was a semi-rural community. True, she had a busy waterfront dominated by the terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad and dotted by the factories that had begun to spring up around the docks. Yet, apart from these signs of fast-growing commercialism, she still managed to convey an air of domesticity. Only a few years back, the infant University of California had removed itself to settle in more spacious surroundings beneath the hills of Berkeley, and perhaps the spirit of a college town still persisted. At least, one can imagine Oaklanders saying to themselves, they were not like that great sprawling Gehenna across the bay. Here was no Barbary Coast with its saloons and brothels, no Chinatown with its opium dens and tong wars. If evil existed along the east shore, it was not openly flaunted. Oakland, in the year 1880, one may assume, was as smugly virtuous as any suburb of a notoriously wicked city, and as dull. Perhaps some such thought may have crossed the mind of Police Officer Fields as he watched the steam train from Oakland Mall discharge its passengers at 7th and Broadway. It was close to 5 o'clock of a July afternoon, the 26th to be exact, and everything, so far as Police Officer Fields could see, was as usual at this busy intersection. There was a cluster of wives and children waiting for father to return from his hard day at the office, the line of hacks drawn up at the curb, newspaper boys hawking the evening editions, and inevitably the odds and ends of humanity who seemed to have nothing better to do than to loaf at train stops. The policeman watched this peaceful scene for a while and then continued his beat up Broadway to 8th Street. About halfway up the block, he was considerably startled to hear a female voice shout, "Murder!" Looking up, he saw a woman leaning out of a window on the northwest corner of Broadway and 8th, waving her arms and repeating this singular word. Not unnaturally, Police Officer Fields ran to the building. On the second floor, he was confronted by a young man, accompanied by a weeping woman and a little girl. The young man said quite calmly, "Officer, do your duty. I have shot a man. No man can seduce my wife and live." Edward Francis Schroeder, according to his friends and business associates, was a cheerful, sociable young man, fond of sport. He was at one time treasurer of a baseball club, a devoted husband and father, and a trusted employee of the London and San Francisco Bank. He was also handsome, if one can believe the newspaper pictures, and was generally thought to be happily married. It was therefore surprising to his cronies when about the middle of June of 1880 a sudden change came over him. He no longer foregathered on the ferry boat with his friends each morning on his way to work in San Francisco, preferring the company of the seagulls on the upper deck. He no longer played cards of an evening, nor went to baseball games, or the races. This change was so marked that its exact date, June 12th, was remembered later by a host of witnesses. When asked if his trouble was financial, his only reply was, "Good God, I wish it was." He began to drink heavily and regretted to one friend that he couldn't get drunk. At the bank he neglected his duties, and when his request for an immediate vacation was denied, he took 2 weeks off anyway, remarking that his employers could do what they liked about it. That he was not summarily fired says much for his value as a bullion clerk, a position he had attained after 8 years at the bank. His leave-taking says even more for a state of mind that would allow him thus willfully to jeopardize his job. What, his friends conjectured among themselves, was the matter with Edward? These friends continued to conjecture until that eventful afternoon of July 26, when Edward Schroeder gave himself up to Police Officer Fields. "Officer, do your duty. I have shot a man. No man can seduce my wife and live." Perhaps ordinary people spoke that way in 1880, but one wonders if Mr. Schroeder had not added amateur theatricals to his other social activities. Even San Francisco, hardened since the days of the gold rush to murder, took note of this particular homicide. Edward Schroeder's melodramatic statement left no doubt in anyone's mind that here was a crime of passion, and one with unusual, even bizarre aspects. Moreover, the protagonists were prominent. What more could a newspaper editor ask for? Such news items as the impending visit of Rutherford B. Hayes, the first president of the United States to visit California, were relegated to the back pages, and reporters sharpened their pencils, prepared to give full coverage to what looked like the juiciest murder since Laura Fair shot Alexander Crittenden on the Oakland San Francisco ferry 10 years earlier. It was perhaps stretching the truth to call Edward Schroeder prominent, but this elastic word was as dear to the journalistic heart then as it is today. Indeed, Edward's background was obscure and undistinguished, and his career at the London and San Francisco Bank could only barely justify the reference to him as a rising banker. What prominence he possessed he owed to association. 8 years earlier he had married the daughter of the Reverend Horatio Stebbins, the Pacific Coast leading Unitarian minister, later to become a regent of the University of California and trustee of Stanford University. This marriage had caused some stir in 1872, for Edward Schroeder and Mary Stebbins had eloped to San Leandro, a neighboring township of Oakland. This in itself was not particularly noteworthy, but it wasn't every day that the daughter of a minister ran away with a ticket seller at a roller skating rink. That year, there was a craze for roller skating, and rings sprang up like weeds on both sides of the bay. In Oakland, one of the most popular was the Pavilion. Mary Stebbins, a pretty, vivacious girl in her late teens, soon caught the fever, and during the spring and early summer, she was often to be seen gracefully displaying her charms at the Pavilion. She also caught the eye of handsome young Edward Schroeder, and it was not long before the ticket seller was playing a more dashing role. For hours, we are told the couple held hands and skated around the rink, even after the regular customers had departed. Presumably, the Reverend Horatio Stebbins had no objections to so healthy and innocent a pastime as roller skating. Under the circumstances, a girl is more in danger of losing her balance than her virtue. But no doubt he had heard about those after-hour sessions with the ticket seller. In any event, he forbade Minnie, as she was called by her family and friends, to see Edward again, and in that amiable but fallacious conceit that nothing cures a lovesick maid like a sea voyage, he planned that she should take a trip with her aunt to Europe. But Minnie planned a much shorter trip, to San Leandro. On June 5, 1872, the very day before she was supposed to leave for Europe, Minnie Stebbins became Mrs. Edward F. Schroeder, and not before it was time, if we consider a certain line of questioning put forth by the prosecution at Edward's trial, a line rightly objected to by the defense. Confronted by a fait accompli, there was little Dr. Stebbins could do but accept his new son-in-law as gracefully as he could. Probably, though this is not known, he was instrumental in getting Edward his job at the bank. You may be sure there was no more ticket selling at the Pavilion. The couple moved into a house in Oakland at 1164 Alice Street near 15th, then a moderately well-to-do neighborhood. Here, according to all reports, they lived a typical suburban existence. Minnie, the mother of two children by 1880, would meet the train that connected with the ferry from San Francisco, sometimes taking the 6-year-old Alice to greet her father on his return from the city. Presumably, the craze for roller skating had died by this time. If not, there was no way for a rising young banker to spend his evenings. No doubt, instead, he took his family boating on nearby Lake Merritt, or leaving the young in charge of Sarah Gallagher, their maid-of-all-work, the pair visited friends or the theater. In short, Edward and Minnie seemed, to their acquaintances and neighbors, to indulge in the same simple if somewhat humdrum pleasures as themselves. Certainly no breath of scandal had ever touched 1164 Alice Street in some 8 years the Schroeders had lived there. All might have continued this way, and Edward might have appeared his usual sunny self that June of 1880 if Minnie had not developed trouble with her teeth. On such little things do great and sometimes tragic events depend. Her choice of dentist, a disastrous choice as it turned out, was Dr. Alfred Lefebvre. He was born in France but had come to America at an early age. After 15 years in Oakland, he had built up an extensive practice, in fact the largest in town. Possibly this is why Minnie chose him, for we have no knowledge that they had met before her first visit to his office. In 1880, Dr. Lefebvre was 47 years old, married to an ailing wife and the father of 4 children, a handsome man with flowing mustache and side whiskers. He was well liked by his patients, who praised his skill, and was generally regarded by the community as an upright and philanthropic citizen. Minnie Schroeder began her visits to Dr. Lefebvre sometime in 1878. Her teeth must have been in shocking condition, for she found it necessary to continue treatment for 2 years, until in fact June 11th, 1880, when according to the defense, Dr. Lefebvre visited her on Alice Street, and again, according to the defense, for very unprofessional reasons. From this evening of June 11th can be dated the trouble that terminated the happiness of Minnie and Edward Schroeder, and eventually the life of Dr. Alfred Lefebvre. We shall return to this important date in due course, for many accusations and denials, rhetoric and bombast, were expended on it during the trial of Edward Schroeder. In the meantime, let us see what happened on that afternoon of July 26, when Police Officer Fields first heard that shout of murder. Dr. Lefebvre, as we have intimated, was a busy dentist. At 5 o'clock that afternoon, a Mrs. Keeney was in the chair having a tooth filled. In the room with her were her mother, Mrs. Spots, wife of Commodore Spots, and the doctor's assistant, Miss Mary Agnew. In an adjoining parlor, several other ladies waited their turn. It did not look as if the doctor was going to get an early dinner. During the operation on Mrs. Keeney, he happened to chip a small piece off her tooth, and not finding the necessary instrument at hand to remedy this accident, he stepped into an adjoining room. A minute later, a shot was heard, and Dr. Lefebvre came reeling back, closely followed by Schroeder. As the dentist fell by the operating chair, no doubt to the astonishment and dismay of his patient, Schroeder fired again. The shot, powder burned the victim's face, struck the door frame and finally lodged in the plaster. The second bullet was unnecessary. The first had proved fatal. Dr. Lefebvre, however, did not die immediately. He lingered long enough to make the statement that he had been attacked by Schroeder, without any provocation from me or any cause for so doing. Meanwhile, a Dr. Brooks, one-time assistant to the dying man, and now in offices of his own down the hall, had made a citizen's arrest. Unnecessarily, since, as we know, it was Edward himself who instructed Officer Fields to do his duty. Then, still accompanied by Minnie and 6-year-old Alice, he was taken to the police station and booked on suspicion of murder. At the coroner's inquest, held the next day, a not surprising verdict of murder was returned against Schroeder, and at the police court hearing, he was committed to jail, without bail, to wait trial for murder in the first degree. Obviously, the only defense could be provocation, and provocation of so grievous a nature as to unhinge the mind of the slayer. To this end, Schroeder's counsel paraded a host of witnesses to testify to the startling change that had come over Edward since June 12th. What had happened on that evening prior to this date? What had transpired to turn a normally cheerful bank clerk into a brooding, hard-drinking homicide? It was a question the Reverend Horatio Stebbins said he had most earnestly wished answered when he visited his daughter at her home on Alice Street, June 12th. My daughter, what is this?" he asked, according to his testimony, to which Minnie replied, "I don't know," as she fell on his neck. Minnie was not being strictly truthful in her answer, and her parents' questions was merely rhetorical, for he had heard what this was that very morning from the lips of his distracted son-in-law. But perhaps one must not expect more than such apostrophes and denials at the beginning of an interview between father and daughter. that is likely to prove accusing and possibly acrimonious. Edward Schroeder's testimony at the police court hearing was straightforward and, as you might expect, dramatic. He testified that he returned home on the evening of June 11th around 9 o'clock and that on entering the front door, he heard someone leaving by the back door. He then went into the kitchen, ostensibly to get himself a glass of water, and found the gaslight still burning, though the household had retired. When he asked his wife who this departing visitor might be, she replied that it was Sarah Gallagher, the servant. Then, exercising that well-known prerogative of her sex, she changed her mind and said it was Sarah's boyfriend. This switch not unnaturally aroused Edward's suspicions, and later in bed he questioned her again, and for all we know again and again and again, until Minnie finally confessed that it was Dr. Lefevre and that he had not touched her. His last statement suggests that she might have anticipated advances, though not necessarily welcoming them. It was sufficient anyway to start Edward gnawing at his luxuriant whiskers and generally playing the outraged husband. Ever true to Thespis, he leaped out of bed, rushed into the children's room, awakened them, and, one assumes, with gestures demanded, "What has your mother done to us?" He then made Minnie swear in front of these sleepy and no doubt thoroughly bewildered infants that she had not wronged them. But back in bed, Minnie, on being questioned further, retracted this denial and admitted to a criminal intercourse with Dr. Lefevre. On the face of it, if Minnie was guilty, she was certainly one of the most casual adulteresses on record. Both time and place appear singularly unpropitious. Edward might well be expected home by 9 o'clock, and a small house occupied by 2 children and a resident servant seems rather cramped quarters for illicit love. Then, too, Dr. Lefevre was no youth, likely to be carried away by sudden desire and willing to risk the consequences of detection. He was middle-aged, French, a people who usually temper passion with reality, and presumably a man of the world. What was back of Minnie's confession? If we are to believe Edward's testimony, we must know what made her admit that she had been unfaithful to him with her dentist. Zach Montgomery, who was a lawyer and an old friend and patient of Dr. Lefevre, and who had emerged from retirement to help prosecute Schroeder, produced an interesting and provocative theory. He contended, and tried to prove at the trial, that Minnie had had a violent quarrel with her dentist over his bill, and that to spite Lefevre, she planned to make her husband believe that the doctor had assaulted her. Thus, or so Montgomery surmised, she would get her revenge and at the same time force Lefevre to cancel her bill. There were elements of absurdity in this theory. It is likely that any woman would admit adultery and risk the wrath of a cuckolded husband for personal revenge, and or to wiggle out of paying a bill. Again, if Minnie was inventing Lefevre's visit that evening, she must have had an accomplice to play the role of the departing door-slamming visitor. Was Sarah Gallagher that accomplice? If so, was Minnie so determined to ruin her dentist's reputation that she would make a confidant of an ignorant Irish servant girl? Montgomery, who was so sure of his theory that at Schroeder's trial he called a Mrs. Beale to the stand to testify that she was in Dr. Lefevre's office on the afternoon of June 11th and overheard a heated argument about a dental bill between the doctor and a heavily veiled lady. As this mysterious lady departed, she turned at the door and, one assumes in a voice that matches a heavy veil, said, "I will have revenge of you." It is perhaps attributing to great prescience to Mr. Montgomery to imagine that he recognized in that exact line a familiar ring, a ring of one who had been long connected with Edward Schroeder. More likely, his belief that this woman was none other than Minnie herself was based on Mrs. Beale's visit to the county jail at a time when Mrs. Schroeder was visiting her husband. Here she identified Minnie's clothes as the same as those worn by the heavily veiled female in Dr. Lefevre's office some 6 weeks earlier. Granted that ladies have a keen eye for what other ladies are wearing, surely when facial recognition, denied Mrs. Beale in this instance on account of the veil, is so often at fault, the matter of a skirt, a mantle, a bonnet becomes an even more dubious method of identification. In any event, the court considered it so, and much to Mr. Montgomery's indignation, Mrs. Beale's testimony was ruled out. But this is not the last we shall hear of Minnie Schroeder's dental bill. On the afternoon of June 12th, after the Reverend Horatio Stebbins had concluded his interview with Minnie, he and Edward appeared at Dr. Lefebvre's office and demanded an accounting for the work the doctor had done on Mrs. Schroeder's teeth. "Have you a bill?" Dr. Stebbins inquired, and then added, in language more suited to Edward, "Produce it in item, or I will blow your brains out." Unfortunately for Dr. Lefebvre, he was unable to comply with this request, which prompted his visitors to assume that the dentist had kept no records of Minnie's appointments, and for a damning reason. If this was so, there is indeed truth in Zach Montgomery's ringing accusation, so piquantly expressed at the trial, that the defendant's wife carries today in the cavities of her teeth the price of her virtue. It was again unfortunate for Dr. Lefebvre that his bookkeeper was not present when Edward and his father-in-law first appeared at the office, for this gentleman could have produced Minnie's bill without trouble. It had been filed under the name Rhoda, to which the bookkeeper had added or Schroeder. When the account was finally unearthed, it totaled $83, and this for 2 years' work o tempora o mores. The inability to find the account, the error in filing, which to the suspicious might connote an attempt to conceal, these were misfortunes that could befall any man. But Lefebvre proceeded to compound them by doing something foolish. At the assistance of Dr. Stebbins, abetted by Schroeder, he received the bill without receiving 1 cent in payment to it. To Schroeder's inflamed mind, this action must have been tantamount to an admission of guilt. Viewed dispassionately, however, it could equally be the action of any frightened man who, confronted by 2 able-bodied and threatening citizens, takes the easy way out and pays up in the hope of preserving his reputation and his skin. Alas, the man in the street seldom views such matters dispassionately. To his censorious and self-righteous eye, Lefebvre's acquiescence to what virtually amounted to blackmail must have looked dangerously like an uneasy conscience. The newspapers, of course, played up this angle, feeding as always on the prurience of the public, so that by the time Schroeder came to trial on November 29th, 1880, the fact that he had killed a man 4 months earlier seemed relatively unimportant. Indeed, most of the hordes of spectators who fought for seats in Superior Judge W. E. Green's Oakland courtroom had probably come less to see justice done than to gloat over the intimate details of an alleged backstairs romance. At any much publicized trial, there is always a seemingly inexhaustible supply of such onlookers who appear to have nothing better to do than witness the embarrassment and often the agony of their fellow man. To these professional ghouls, Edward Schroeder had become the wronged man, and doubtless among themselves and the world at large they talked loudly about the sanctity of the home, the unwritten law, not forgetting, of course, the snake in the grass, a French snake, mind you, and other such pretentious nonsense. To listen to them, you might think the victim, not the killer, was on trial. The prosecution was in the hands of Alameda County's District Attorney Colonel E. M. Gibson, a veteran of the Civil War, who, fighting on the Union side, had lost a leg at Gettysburg. At this time he was nearing 40, a florid, articulate jurist, much addicted to quoting in court from Shakespeare and Holy Writ. Indeed, the legal talent on both sides in this case so frequently employed these sources, you might think the Bard and Moses were as necessary to the profession's bag of tricks as Blackstone. Gibson was aided by Assistant District Attorney Wells Whitmore and the previously mentioned Zach Montgomery. For the defense were W. W. Foote and A. A. Moore, both well-known lawyers in the Bay Area, and the redoubtable Hall McAllister, generally considered by his confreres to be the most outstanding member of the California bar. Testimony to this is evident in the life-size statue of him, which still stands near the Civic Center in San Francisco, facing the street that bears his name. The presiding judge was William E. Green, who had but recently been elected judge of the Superior Court. This was to be his first important murder trial. Because the newspapers had devoted column after column to both the coroner's inquest and the police court hearing, it was difficult to impanel a jury who had not formed some sort of opinion from these journals. Oakland, too, was a small town in those days, and many prospective jurors claimed friendship or business dealings with the principals involved. After 3 days of challenges, the supply of veneer men ran so low that one of the last men chosen was one who admitted that for many years Dr. Lefebvre had been his dentist, although he stated that this connection would in no way affect his verdict. Louis Whiting was perhaps the most engaging juror. Recorded as a horseman, which probably meant that he was an ostler rather than a frequenter of bridle paths, he assured his questioners that he had never heard of the case and added, "I believe in justice for all. If I go to hell, let me go." This delightful if somewhat obscure declaration caused a sensation in court according to the Oakland Tribune. Possibly in 1880 it was sensational for a man to pronounce his beliefs in public. The case for the prosecution was opened by the assistant district attorney. He was a sober telling of what happened on that afternoon on July 26, when Dr. Lefebvre was shot to death in his office, much of it a recapitulation of the hearing in the police court. Certain exhibits, such as the gun that killed the victim, were identified and entered in evidence. Witnesses: Mary Agnew, the nurse, Officer Fields, Mrs. Keeney, that most unfortunate of innocent bystanders, and others were called and repeated substantially what they had said in the lower court. One new figure appeared, Ada Goulden, a schoolgirl who had been waiting her turn for the dentist's chair, occupying the time with her geography lesson. Ada admitted that on hearing the shooting, she very sensibly ran away. The defense, for some reason, seemed to think it necessary to cross-examine this child. Why had she run away? Answer: I had to catch the 4:50 train. She added gratuitously that she didn't make it. The most important witnesses at this stage were two gunsmiths, who testified to selling pistols to Schroeder on two different occasions. The first had been on July 5th, a pertinent date, for Dr. Stebbins had testified earlier that on the 6th of July he had been walking with Edward in Oakland when suddenly his son-in-law, mistaking a man for Lefebvre, whipped out a gun and chased him down 8th Street. So violent an action had alarmed Dr. Stebbins, as well it might, and he had persuaded Schroeder to return the gun. This Edward did on the 8th or 9th of July, telling the gunsmith that he had originally bought it for a friend who had no use for it. On July 26th, the day of the shooting, he returned to the shop and purchased another gun. It was with this weapon that the dentist had been fatally shot. With these witnesses, the prosecution of course hoped to establish premeditation, an important point if they were to obtain a first-degree conviction. The plea for the defense, as everyone imagined it would be, was provocation, and such provocation as to render the defendant temporarily insane. To this end many witnesses testified, as they had in the police court, to Edward's extreme depression after June 11th, his trembling hands, his inability to do his work at the bank, and a sudden addiction to the bottle. But it was Dr. Stebbins' testimony that carried most weight. On being questioned by Mr. Foote about a trip that he and Edward had taken to Santa Rosa, presumably to take the latter's mind off his troubles, the good doctor waxed both eloquent and dramatic. Question: Was he a danger to others? Answer: At Santa Rosa, after we had refreshed ourselves, he drew a long breath, a sigh, and a groan, and as he drew the breath he seemed as if he were about to plunge at me. Question: What did you do? Answer: I rose up and embraced him and kissed him and prevented him from attacking me and massaged him. Question: How did you do it? Answer: If you will sit down at the table, I will show you. Whereupon Dr. Stebbins illustrated on Mr. Foote most graphically, the newspapers reported, his method of massaging. Perhaps the reporters were in awe of the redoubtable minister, or editors cut their copy, for none goes beyond that tantalizing most graphically. Throughout the trial all the newspapers devoted columns of minute type to the legal and medical jargon attendant on the matter of insanity. Yet they passed up this splendid opportunity of giving readers a word picture of an elderly bewhiskered clergyman embracing an elderly bewhiskered lawyer. At least, one hopes the spectators enjoyed it. For them, this particular day of the trial was rewarding, for aside from Dr. Stebbins' illustrative testimony, they were treated to some fireworks and comic relief in the person of Sarah Gallagher. His servant was a type of witness that makes lawyers wake up in the middle of the night screaming. She was garrulous, inconsistent, contradictory, and impertinent. She also, in the words of Colonel Gibson, could talk faster than a horse can trot. The colonel had good reason to try to ridicule Sarah, for her testimony was most damaging to the prosecution's case. She claimed that Dr. Lefebvre had confessed to her his guilty connection with Minnie Schroeder and admitted to being the person who had left the house by the back door that evening of June 11th. She told of nightly meetings with the dentist on shady corners of Alice Street, where she reported what was going on in the Schroeder menage, notably the state of her master's mind. Lefebvre seemed to have gone in fear for his life, for he repeatedly asked Sarah to search in Schroeder's drawers and closets for evidence of any gun. This she did, telling him she could find no weapon. On one occasion, Sarah testified she met the dentist at his office where he offered to pay her for these services. Sarah refused, saying that she was poor but proud. The last time she saw Lefebvre was again in his office during the morning of that fatal July 26th. She had gone to warn him that Mrs. Schroeder had agreed to meet her husband at the train that afternoon, and that she, Sarah, was afraid they might go directly to the dental parlor and give the whole thing away. Sarah's testimony up to this point had favored the defendant. That it showed great provocation, but this last statement suggests she knew what was in Schroeder's mind that day. Else, why would she have gone to Lefebvre's office, and as she testified later have said, "You had better not be in the office this afternoon, but if you do, keep the door locked for fear he should walk in." Her position in the Schroeder household during the weeks between the discovery of Minnie's alleged faithlessness and the shooting of Lefebvre seems to have been an anomalous and perhaps not unenjoyable one. She suddenly found herself the confidant of her betters and in the exciting, if at times dangerous, position of hunting with the hounds and running with the hare. For while she was meeting Lefebvre on street corners and reporting Schroeder's attitude towards him, she was being questioned by her master about the dentist. A busybody, you might say, in both the exact and the general sense of the word. One wonders how she had time to perform her household chores. Yet, she had still further time to guard Minnie against Edward's outbursts of fury. "May I kiss her?" he asked of Sarah on one occasion. Whereupon he went into the bedroom where Minnie was lying in bed and punched her nose so that the sheets were drenched in blood. To the servant's inquiry as to why he treated his wife so brutally, he replied, "Sarah, she is defiled." The truth of this Judas-like act was confirmed by Dr. Stebbins, who testified that on July 5th he visited his daughter and found her countenance was all covered with extravasated blood. Cross-examined by Zach Montgomery, Sarah's memory for dates and places of meetings with Lefebvre became increasingly vague. She fell back on the classic "I don't remember very well," and when pressed for details grew more and more confused. Like many another in a similar position, being angry and adopted an "I'm as good as you are" attitude. Question: do you consider you were doing right while a paid servant of Mr. Schroeder to act a spy on him? Answer: thank you. I consider myself an honest girl, whether you do or not. When questioned about going to a priest to tell him about the case, Sarah was outraged. Question: did you tell him, the priest, that Dr. Lefebvre admitted about his improper relations with Mrs. Schroeder? Answer: well, Mr. Montgomery, I do not think that I would tell that to Father McGuire, a clergyman. I know better. Question: did you? Answer: I did not. Question: tell us what you did tell him. Answer: would you expect that I would go and express myself to a clergyman like that? What do you take me for? Sarah Gallagher's testimony, confusing and contradictory as it was, must have had its effect on the jury. While it does not seem likely that a man in Lefebvre's position would confide in a servant girl, it is equally unlikely that Sarah had invented these tales of nightly meetings. Zach Montgomery could hear her testimony to shreds on small details, but she remained unshaken about the main and most damaging facts. He and his associates must have been relieved when she finally stepped down and completed her day in court. The prosecution now tried to vilify Edward Schroeder's character in order to prove that during the 6 weeks between Minnie's confession and the shooting of her alleged paramour, he had been anything but morose and depressed. Policemen were called, among them our old friend Officer Fields, to testify that Schroeder had been seen coming out of saloons and houses of ill fame. Officer Fields stated that he had been seen the defendant being sick in the gutter at 1 o'clock in the morning, and a brother officer swore that on the night of June 27th he had witnessed Edward's departure from a house over Barnum's Saloon at 7th and Broadway. Surely, the defense pointed out in rebuttal, such manifestations of debauchery, if they ever occurred, evidence of a man desperate to drown his sorrows, and not those of a gay boulevardier intent on tasting the joys of Oakland's nightlife. This being a debatable point, the defense called two frail females, as the newspaper so delicately described them, who swore they had never seen Schroeder on the evening in question, nor on any other evening. Their testimony was corroborated by three gentlemen of singularly regular habits, who stated that they were nightly frequenters of this house over Barnum's, and that they had never seen Schroeder there. To cinch the matter, the defense produced another customer, who admitted he had been present on the night of the 27th, and who, standing beside the defendant upon the attorney's request, looked so remarkably like Edward that the two could have passed for brothers. Thus the policeman's testimony not only failed to help the prosecution, but also backfired rather badly. Though a matter of mistaken identity, the jury might well think that here was a typical case of the cops trying to get a conviction. Zach Montgomery did his best to retrieve the situation by hammering away at Sarah Gallagher's story. Why, he asked, should the Favre make a confidant of a servant girl? I don't believe counsel fixed up that story, because I think they could have fixed it better, so I acquit them. Sarah was the villain, an unconscionable liar who desired nothing but to shine in the limelight of a public trial. In further attempts to impugn Sarah's character, he claimed that she had once been an inmate of Magdalen Asylum, a home for unwed mothers. This irrelevance was objected to by the defense, but howsoever firmly a judge orders a statement stricken from the record, it remains in the mind of the most impartial of jurors. In this instance, it was of no great importance, for surely a Magdalen is not of necessity an Ananias. Again, over objections, Montgomery wished to know why Minnie Schroeder had not been called by the defense. Surely, he argued, here was one person who knew the truth. Hal McAllister's excuse for not doing so was that this lady has suffered enough, and my client felt that, rather than expose his wife to cross-examination, he would risk the hazard of your verdict. Montgomery ended his speech with somewhat oblique praise for Dr. Stebbins' testimony. There are the footprints of truth in all the doctor tells us, and by those footprints I will track the murderer to the doom he so richly deserves. The last 2 days of the trial were occupied mainly with lengthy and learned expositions by various medical experts on insanity. Both Foote and McAllister argued eloquently in defense of their client, claiming, as they had done repeatedly during the preceding days, that Schroeder was out of his mind when he shot Lefebvre. Had he planned to kill the dentist, McAllister asked, would he have taken his wife and child with him to the dental parlor? Here perhaps the lawyer was mistaken, because, aware as we are of Edward's flair for the dramatic and of his love for an audience, this was precisely what he might well have done. Colonel Gibson, in his final address to the jury, dwelt on the plight of the living rather than of the dead. He drew a picture of the widow and her children standing beside the open grave, into which the light of their life had been plunged by the bullet of the assassin. While he expatiated on the once happy hearthstone, according to the Oakland Times, tears sprang into the eyes of strong men to whom tears had been strangers for years. Judge Green's charge to the jury, though it infuriated Zach Montgomery, seems to have been a balanced one. He informed the jurors that intent to kill must be proved for a first-degree verdict. They must not pay too much attention to whether Dr. Lefebvre and Mrs. Schroeder were guilty of adultery or not. If the defendant was convinced of their guilt, and the thought of it drove him insane, then a verdict of acquittal must be brought in. The jury retired the evening of December and slept that night on mattresses laid down on the jury room. The next day's paper reported the vote deadlock by bedtime at 6-6, but by breakfast next morning it was 8-4 for acquittal, and by that evening 10-2. The next day was a Sunday on which, very appropriately, they sought divine guidance by singing hymns such as, "O give me faith to see the light," and "Direct me, Lord, I know not what to do." This choice of hymns might indicate that the jurors were not in agreement at this point, but the choice can hardly have been the measuring stick by which the newspapers gauged the odds. If so, Lewis Whiting, the juror, could do a stretch of the imagination he reported as a holdout for the death penalty. His contribution to the singing was a solo of "Come to Jesus Just Now." At 4 o'clock on Monday afternoon, December 13th, 4½ months after the crime, the jury returned to court and rendered their verdict: not guilty. Immediately, Edward Schroeder leapt to his feet, and rushing over to the jury, embraced them singly and collectively, wringing their hands and crying, "God bless you, God bless you." Tears gushed from his eyes. According to one of the newspapers, he threw himself on the breast of these men. Good old Edward, a trooper to the end. The verdict seems to have been a popular one with the masses. We are told that the prisoners in the jail cheered Edward when he returned to his cell to pick up his belongings, and as he drove back to Alice Street in a cab with Minnie and Mr. Foote beside him. The passer-by waved their hats at him. The newspapers were more reserved. They reported the verdict with little editorial comment, and the day after the trial ended, the story of Edward and Minnie Schroeder vanished from their columns. In much the same way, Edward and Minnie vanished from Oakland. Their names were still recorded in the city directory for 1881, but after that they were dropped. Diligent research fails to reveal what happened to them. Presumably, they left the Bay Area to live in some distant community where the name of Schroeder did not immediately bring to mind the picture of cuckoldry and sudden death. It would be nice to think that in this new life, Edward gave up banking for the boards. He would have been a natural for the melodrama of his day. One hopes, too, that Minnie had no further trouble with her teeth.